Coming up, the Autry Museum of the American West honors the memory of tribal leader Marshall McKay. Plus, what's cooking in Oklahoma City, a new cookbook from a Pottawatomi chef. And we learn more about last week's Not Invisible report from the Departments of Justice and the Interior. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines on the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
The ICT Newscast is sponsored by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, a nonprofit organization serving American Indian nations and people in the recovery and control of their rightful homelands. On the web at iltf.org.
Support for the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez comes from the Arizona PBS studios in Phoenix at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Arizona State University.
Amidao Ahopa, thank you for joining us. A federal commission is telling Congress that there must be long-term, substantial pushes to address the crisis of missing, murdered, and trafficked Indigenous people. The 35-member Not Invisible Act Commission held hearings virtually and across the country, listening to some 260 witnesses about their experiences, suffering, and hopes regarding missing and murdered Indigenous people. The report calls for more and consistent funding so that tribes can take on some of the criminal justice issues directly. The commission asked for $1.2 billion for law enforcement and detention facilities, and that the funding should be mandatory, not discretionary. Too many critical justice programs are currently at risk because they are grant dependent. The report says jurisdictional clarity is essential, including the repeal of laws that stripped tribes of authority on criminal justice issues. Then law enforcement, medical teams, and social workers will better understand their roles in addressing the crisis. The commission was created under the Not Invisible Act, sponsored by then Representative Deb Haaland, before she joined the Biden cabinet as the Interior Secretary. The Department of Justice and the Department of the Interior have 90 days to consider the recommendations. Later on in our show, we'll hear from members of the commission on the two-year effort that led to the report. Well, the nation's largest and oldest coalition of tribal governments in the U.S. surprised many with a new logo last week. On the start of Native American Heritage Month, the National Congress of American Indians said it is entering a new chapter.
This is NCAI's new identity, a symbol of unity, hope, and progress, one that represents the enduring spirit coursing through the veins of tribal nations, because together we are an unshakable force.
The new logo features an eagle. Its 12 feathers represent NCAI's 12 regions, while the forward wings represent the next 7 generations. Along with the new logo, the organization also revamped its website and launched a podcast called The Centennial. Next week, members of NCAI are set to meet in New Orleans, Louisiana for its annual convention. The list of action items there include a proposal that would limit the membership of state-recognized tribes to join NCAI, as well as electing a new president. We head now to California, where a new strain of bird flu is threatening the conservation efforts of an endangered bird by at least a decade. ICT's Nick Parks reports.
For the past 40 years, experts have tried to prevent the California condor from going extinct. The wild population dropped to less than 350 in flocks spanning from the Pacific Northwest to Baja California, Mexico. One of the reasons experts are so concerned is because of a rise in cases of the deadliest strain of avian flu in U.S. history. But there is hope. The California condor is the only bird species in the U.S. that has been approved for an emergency use of the bird flu vaccine.
California condors are today receiving boosters for avian influenza. This is a vaccine to hopefully give some protection against highly pathogenic avian influenza. So this is a vaccine developed for the poultry industry that we're trying to see if it's safe for the California condors. So these are the trials, sort of the safety trials for these birds.
Authorities fast-tracked the vaccine after 21 free-flying condors in Arizona died of avian influenza. They feared the outbreak's toll on the California population would erase efforts to rebuild it. Several tribal nations hold the bird in high regard, including the Yurok, who have led their own efforts to save it. In Phoenix, Arizona, Nick Parks, ICT News.
Officials already vaccinate condors in captivity and in the wild for West Nile virus. One more museum is going through its collections and following up with the return of human remains. ICT's Demi Dupavillon has the story.
This month, the American Museum of Natural History in New York City said it will return some 12,000 sets of human remains to what it calls relevant communities. The museum's artifacts were collected by researchers in the 19th and 20th centuries trying to prove racial superiority through physical features. Some of the artifacts were dug up from graveyards of Indigenous people and enslaved Black people. A few of the remains were bodies used by medical schools, such as Columbia, Cornell, and New York University. Part of the reason this was allowed to happen was because a generation ago, many states permitted these schools to use bodies from unclaimed poor people. All of this comes months after the institution hired a new president. In April, Sean Decatur became the museum's first Black leader. He said that for the most part, the remains in the collection were gathered without clear consent. 6 of the museum's galleries will be affected by the repatriation, and there will be no more public displays that contain human bones or other remains. According to the Associated Press, around 870,000 Native American artifacts that should have been returned to tribes under federal law are still in the hands of colleges, museums, and other institutions. A federal law passed in 1990 created a legal process for some tribal governments to recover ancestral remains. It applies to around 2,200 artifacts at the museum. So far, the American Museum of Natural History has yet to determine what remains will be returned, as well as how to properly store and care for those it continues to hold. Reporting in Phoenix, Arizona, Demi Dupavillon, ICT News.
It's not just Indigenous remains that are contentious. At least 5 African American people had their bones removed from a northern Manhattan burial ground from a road construction project at the start of the 1900s. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. We return now to the Not Invisible Act Commission's recommendations issued last week to Congress. The sweeping report calls for a decade of action and healing, and if the roadmap is followed, it will have a sweeping impact in Indian country. It was hard and emotional work for over 2 years for the commissioners. Mark Trahant has more.
The long road to the report began 4 years ago when then U.S. House Representative Deb Haaland introduced the Not Invisible Act in Congress. Now, as Interior Secretary, Haaland spelled out why the act is necessary.
Everyone deserves to feel safe in their communities, but the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis is one that Native communities have faced since the dawn of colonization. For too long, this issue has been swept under the rug with a lack of urgency, attention, and funding. The rates of missing persons cases in the American Indian and Alaska Native communities are disproportionate, alarming, and unacceptable. It's heartbreaking to know that our loved ones are at an increased risk of disappearing without warning, and that many times cases go unsolved and unaddressed, leaving families and communities devastated. But I believe we are at an inflection point, and we can't turn back. In Congress, I led the Not Invisible Act to garner attention for this issue. Now, in partnership with the Justice Department and along with extensive engagement with tribes and other stakeholders, Interior is determined to marshal our resources to implement these laws to finally address the crisis of violence against Indigenous peoples.
For the past 2 years, the 37-member commission studied the issues and heard testimony at 8 hearings. The panel heard testimony that was heartbreaking. The conclusions last week represent the first comprehensive attempt to address the issue.
It was so hard. I mean, I still get the chills from listening to all of the listening sessions, and when I had went to Arizona, and I flew back home, and I was about to land in Oklahoma, and I lost it. I had lost it because it's so harsh of what's happening in Indian country. It's it really it was really hard, and I know it was hard for all the commission members, so I know what they went through too. So, I just, pray for all of the commission members for all the hard work they did as well, because, it hit every bit of your body, your emotion side, your physical side, your mental, it hit every part of the medicine wheel. And I just, I learned a lot, and I, it changed me. It changed me to see how our Indigenous people are doing, and how they've been um, treated as if they're invisible.
The Commission's report includes a pointed call for the return of jurisdictional sovereignty to tribes that have been systematically handcuffed in their ability to police their own peoples.
I think the power of sovereign nations is that tribes can say, okay, you know what, we're going to start doing things the way we want to. You see a lot of tribes using community resource plans. Tribes can come up with their own response plans of when somebody goes missing or when somebody's murdered, and they could say, this is what we're going to do, and these are all the individuals who need to be involved. Tribes have the ability to make their own rules and stuff, and also their own laws.
And a special nod to the difficulties faced in Alaska.
I mean, I learned so much about Alaska during these 2 years, and I just learned how remote it was and how they don't have direct access to basically people coming within an hour or two. Sometimes it's like a day people will come to investigate a death, and that's really hard to grapple with.
The report also highlighted the different ways the media addresses missing person events.
When a Caucasian goes missing, you see all kinds of task forces and agencies and media and all those things happen. But when it comes to the Indigenous people, it just doesn't happen. So, we're hoping that these laws are going to close that gap into making sure that we're included and we're just as important as the next person that goes missing.
Today, there is one measure of hope.
I hope that individuals who read this report realize that this is such a multifaceted issue, and that it's really going to take a lot of people coming together to slow it down and eventually stop it. That's the goal.
That's my hope, is that, everything will, will make some change. And I know it's just the beginning, but I know that something will become of it.
The missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis is centuries in the making and will take a focused effort and time to unravel the many threads that contribute to the alarming rates of cases. I'm grateful for the communities and the organizers who rang the alarm and gave a voice to the missing. My heart goes out to the families whose loved ones have disappeared. We'll keep working until our people stop going missing without a trace.
Reporting from Phoenix, Arizona, Mark Trahant, ICT News.
The Alliance of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums met in Oklahoma City recently, and ICT's Shirley Snavy was there. She spoke with Joe Horscapture, who is the Vice President of Native Collections at the Amundsen Curator of Native History and Culture. Take a look.
So as an institution, we realize that we don't know everything. So that is sort of the first point. The other point is, how do we what methodology can we use to get information about different topics back out to Indian country? So that's where we came up with the idea for the seminar. Marshall McKay was the first Native board member at the Autry. He passed away a couple years back. He was very much of a believer in distribution of knowledge. And what we did, in a sense of how do we redistribute this knowledge, we brought a lot of people together, museum curators, academics, both native and non-native, traditional folks, artists, these kind of writers. So we live stream it, and then also we put it on YouTube. Then we get that link and we send it out to all the tribal museums that we have a list for. It's constantly growing, as well as tribal colleges. And then for last year, what we did is we created a small publication, like 50 pages. And that publication was a selected papers from seminar from both days. And then that publication, which was never available for sale, we send that to tribal archives, tribal college libraries. So that way, one of the challenges when you have seminars with knowledgeable people is if you're not there, all that great information, all that expense, all these knowledge keepers, however one wants to define it, come together, and if you're not sitting in the audience, then it's gone. So with this methodology, which actually my father used back when he was curator of the Plains Indian Museum in Cody, Wyoming in the 80s, he had the Plains Indian Seminar. This is similar in the sense that if you have a publication, of course YouTube didn't exist back then, but if you have a publication, then people can always refer to that knowledge at some point in the future. So this year, which is one day, we have it on November 18th. It's about baskets. And that day is divided into two. The first, this is being organized by a couple of my staff, Amanda Wixon and Karima Richardson. So the first half of the day, we're going to have, traditional style seminar with papers, talking about cultural revitalization of baskets, talk about environmental resources that are happening in different tribes across the country. Then the second half of the day is workshop, and that's sort of a closed session. We're keeping the numbers very limited to Native folks who are either beginner basket weavers or moderate basket weavers. And we'll have them in the classrooms, and they hand out all the material so they can actually learn how to create baskets. And a lot of that, of course, a lot of the inspiration comes from our collection. So it's sort of the idea of looking at works that were done by our ancestors, creating a format of bringing people together to teach, and then those that are taught ensuring that that knowledge sort of continues to flow. So it's the idea of, oftentimes people think of museum collections as just sort of sitting there and inactive. Through some of our efforts, of course there's always more to do, through some of our efforts we try to find ways that we can to activate it, to ensure that the information that's held within these works, some of them we don't know, is transmitted back to the community in one way or the other.
The topic for next year's seminar is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act.
So there's sort of two avenues with returning items to communities. One of them is the legal structure, which Rick talked about. It's NAGPRA. Then for us in California, it's NAGPRA, or CalNAGPRA, excuse me. And those have very specific areas, right? Human remains, associated funerary objects, unassociated funerary objects, objects of cultural patrimony, and sacred items. And those legal definitions are kind of really structured. But museum collections, there's a very small percentage, considering how big museum collections often are, that theoretically could actually apply to these two repatriation laws. You have these other material, like, for lack of a better way of putting it, anthropologists would call them material culture, like moccasins, leggings, depending on where you're from, baskets, whatever the case may be. And either through private donors or museums that have works in their collection that don't fulfill the mandate of their collection policy, like the Cherokee Museum, they want to return those items back to their communities. So that brings up sort of a lot of, in my mind, that brings up a lot of interesting kind of questions. As you know, as a Native person, as a Native person, and a second generation Native American curator, you know, I think about these things maybe slightly different than your average curatorial person would be. How do we define community? Does it return to an individual? Does it return to the tribe? Does it return to the museum? But for my reservation, it's crazy political. Oftentimes, a tribal council is out of step with what the community is doing. So how do we sort that out? You know, if we have, these are we're talking about non-sacred items, you know, material culture, as they say. How do we sort that out, who it goes back to? Because if you give it to the tribal government, which is we're federally recognized, so it's a sovereign nation. So you're dealing with a separate government, right? So theoretically, you have to deal with the tribal council. But what if the tribal council is not on the same page as the people? So if you have community where you have holy people, and they're not necessarily in step with the tribal council, what do you do?
In Lincoln, Nebraska, Shirley Snavy, ICT News.
A new museum features the tribes of Oklahoma. ICT's Shirley Snavy was there to see what's cooking. Loretta Barrett Oden is the chef at 39 Restaurant. Take a look.
Oh, yeah. Wee. Oh, yo, eh. Oh, yo, eh. Oh, yo, eh. Oh, yo, eh. Hey, yeah. Hey, yeah.
Come see us at 39 at the First Americans Museum. The museum is stunning. It's gorgeous. It's absolutely worth seeing, and the food's pretty worth eating as well.
That's great. Loretta Barrett Oden is the chef at 39 Restaurant.
I'm laughingly say I'm the Indian in the cupboard. So I try to keep them on track, you know, what food we're supposed to be cooking and serving here. I've been involved with this project for probably 17 years. This was kind of a stutter start. You know, we'd get going and then, you know, we'd shut down, but it finally is open. We opened in September of 21, so 39, which pays homage to the 39 tribes of Oklahoma. And so I'm trying to kind of replicate what I did in Santa Fe. So doing First Americans cuisine, doing a lot of buffalo, venison, quail, a lot of veggie stuff. Our garden out there growing corn, beans, and squash, which is exciting. That's a program of TSET, the Tobacco Settlement Group called Shape Your Future. And so we're trying to get healthy food back on the tables for our people.
Loretta's new cookbook will introduce you to some of these dishes.
It's named after the Corn Dance Cafe in Santa Fe, where this all began. And so my first book signing is going to be in Santa Fe next week. So I'm really excited about that. So this is geared for the home cook. So they're pretty simple, straightforward recipes. And I think everyone will have fun. A lot of my story in there. So that's going to be fun too.
I asked Loretta what her inspiration was for cooking.
I guess growing up in Oklahoma, a big family. The Pottawatomi side of my family, my mom was one of 9 kids. And I had grandmas and aunties. And so it had to do with, you know, growing up in the kitchen, singing, laughing, cooking. That inspiration kind of carried through my life, raising my kids and all of that. And then I took a departure, left Oklahoma, and ended up in Santa Fe. And my eldest son, Clay, and I opened the Corn Dance Cafe. 3 favorite recipes. Well, it has to be the Three Sisters and Friends saute. So that's my one with corned beans, squash, quinoa, wild rice. Really quick, easy saute. And then it's garnished with a sage pesto. Really tasty. Everything that you can buy at your local grocery store. Hopefully you'll grow it yourself. That makes it that much better. And 3 top ones. We're doing a really good Santa Fe influence hominy stew. It's basically pozole, but we're in Oklahoma, so we're calling it hominy stew. So it's pretty, it's red and spicy, very tasty. We're doing that with bison meat rather than pork. And we're also doing a chicken green chili stew, which is pretty tasty. I'm doing corn ice cream, my flourless chocolate cake that I call Loretta's Obsession. With blackberry cobblers, some really good food going on here.
In Lincoln, Nebraska, Shirley Snavy, ICT News.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.